Hello, everyone. Our next panel on food insecurity will begin very shortly, in approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes.
I went to, the reason was Austrian Airlines, I remember that with my assistant. We went to UK, Belgium, somewhere else.
You were involved in immigration. I mean, this people are both men around that same time. And yes, we were both in business, as I said this morning. So the alcohol was full.
But that was a great place. I'd never been to Australia.
So I was flying. Now when I go back to quite a bit of work in fashion. I used to be Toronto to Addis non-stop, 14 and a half hours. What an era. And then connection to
Better rates or better service?
service.
Sorry, we're just going to begin again. Okay, what's going on with the water situation? The microphones are okay, so Good morning, and thank you so much for those of us in person and joining us online for the second panel of the day for the Walter Gordon Symposium focused on affordability, looking at cross-sectoral perspectives, challenges, and solutions. I'll now like to introduce the individual who will be welcoming the next panel, Rojani, a junior fellow here at Massey College, and a very helpful hand in situating a number of key pieces, logistical and operational, for today's event. And without her support, we would actually not be here today. So thanks so much, Rojani, and welcome.
Thank you, Harvin. What a great introduction for myself. I feel flattered. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It is such a pleasure to see this beautiful audience at Massey College on this beautiful day of spring. And I hope that, like myself, you are very happy that the days of winter are over. My name is Rojani Dorsa. As Arvin mentioned, I'm a student in counseling psychology and global mental health at OISE, University of Toronto, and a junior fellow at Massey. It is my great honor to introduce the speakers of the food security panel this morning. First, I would like to welcome Dr. Jo Sharma. Dr. Jo Sharma trained in history at the University of Delhi and Cambridge, where she was a Commonwealth Scholar. She taught at Carnegie Mellon and Western universities, also a researcher fellow at Yale University, and is currently an associate professor of food and environmental studies at the University of Toronto. She is a founding member of the U of T Culinary Research Center and the Food Studies undergrad and graduate programs. She holds graduate appointments at the Department of History, the School of Environment, and at DPES. She is a faculty affiliate of the SDGs Scholars Academy, School of the Cities, Center for Critical South Asian Humanities, and the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies. Dr. Sharma is a fellow of the Wild Geographical Society and an elected board member of the Association for the Study of Food and Society. She is the founding co-editor of Culinaria book series, and editor of the Empowers in Perspective history book series. She is also co-editor of the Global Food History Journal. Dr. Sharma, we are delighted to have you with us today. Next, it is my great pleasure to introduce Caroline. Sorry, my sheet got messed up. I am delighted to introduce Caroline Seward with us on the panel. Caroline is the CEO of Feed Ontario, Ontario's only provincial network dedicated to serving food bank and hunger relief agency. Since joining Feed Ontario in 2009, Caroline has held a variety of roles, driving the organization's operation and program development. Since 2016, she has held the role of CEO, leading the organization through its rebranding, research and advocacy portfolio, response and recovery to COVID-19, and continual expansion of program and service to meet growing demand. Caroline is a graduate from the University of Guelph with a major in public policy and criminal justice, and more recently, Cornell University in equitable community change. She is a top 40 under 40 honoree and is a passionate advocate for food security and social justice. In her spare time, Caroline loves baking, the outdoors, and spending time with her husband, 2 kids, and dog Pepper. We are grateful to have you on this panel, Caroline. Next, I have Mr. Don McTeague. So Mr. Don McTeague, again, my sheets got messed up. Great, here we go. Mr. Don McTeague is a prominent Canadian energy advocate with more than 3 decades of experience spanning both the public and private sectors. He serves for 18 years as a member of parliament, earning a national reputation for his expertise in energy pricing and for helping Canadians make sense of fuel costs through clear, reliable forecasts. During his time in office, he championed practical, consumer-focused policies, and prioritizing making Canada a more affordable place to live and raise a family. Today, Massey is the president for Affordable Energy, where he provides trusted analysis and commentary on energy policy and pricing. Known for his direct and accessible approach, he is a consistent voice for pragmatic energy solution, frequently challenging policies such as carbon taxes and regulatory burdens that increase the cost of gasoline, home heating, and electricity. A sought-after commentator among media and policymakers, Massey continues to advocate for a strong and reliable Canadian energy sector, one that lowers costs, supports jobs, and ensure energy remain affordable for all Canadians. Mr. Massey, a very warm welcome to you. And lastly, it is my great honor to introduce our own junior fellow here at Massey, Benjamin Robisher, as the moderator of this discussion. Benjamin is a third-year graduate student pursuing a Master of Environmental Science degree at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. His peer-reviewed research centers on deforestation, land use change, and zoonotic spread of disease, topics that closely intersect with issues of food security. His writing on environmental issues and current affairs has appeared in the Toronto Star, The Conversation, and Canadian Geographic, among other outlets. His current work includes a climate change impact assessment on the spread of vector-borne diseases in Scarborough, a methodological paper interpreting what is sometimes known as the crisis of expertise through the lens of classical rhetorical theory, and supporting a qualitative study by Dr. Hannah Morris on environmental policy communication in newspapers of record. Further, his experience spans both the academic and private sectors as a strategic consultant with the consultancy Accenture for several years. Benjamin's cross-sector experience informs his belief that progress on big challenges of affordability and sustainability can only be made when disciplines collaborate and all segments of society are engaged. Welcome, Ben. With that, I will now pass it to you to guide us in what promises to be a thoughtful conversation. Thank you.
Excellent, Ranjani. Thank you so much. And I want to just echo those sentiments. I want to thank our distinguished panelists for being here today and dedicating your time to the Walter Gordon Symposium. And the same kind of warm feeling goes out to everyone who's here in the room today, as well as those who are joining us virtually. So hello to those out there in TV land as well. So we'll begin today in our panel on food security by giving each panelist the opportunity to share some opening remarks to orient perhaps what they kind of intend to kind of focus on during the course of our panel today. And then I will begin with some questions. First, some personalized warm-up questions feature our panelists, and then we'll proceed from there. So perhaps Dan may like to get us started with some opening remarks on food security in Canada.
Well, Ben, thank you very much for this, and I appreciate the invitation. It's good to be with Tom again, someone who I looked up to as a young man, and some other friends that I haven't seen in quite some time. Mr. Lottens, who started with me in Parliament Hill 1982, 44 years ago. And that shows the gray hair. I'm here most to talk about the issue of energy and its impact on the cost of living, but also, most importantly, food. My father worked in the food industry for a number of years. Work I had done on the Competition Act as a member of Parliament dealt with the closing of competition, the eclipsing of competition at the retail level, and of course the potential consequences for suppliers to those new arrangements, those new organizations. We're talking Empire Foods, Loblaws, and Provigo at the time, which of course would have a knock-on effect years down the road. I could not have possibly calculated how that would turn out 30, 40 years later. But it's fair to say that when we are looking at the issue of energy in particular, for which I've spent a considerable amount of time, the context in which you called this, it couldn't have been more interesting. We are dealing with a food crisis, to be sure, an affordability crisis that's likely to get a lot worse before it gets better, given the events that we're seeing unfold in the Persian Gulf. And so the context is extremely important to recognize what policies can be adopted, which approaches can be taken to mitigate the impact this is going to have on people who have no choice but to choose between rent, mortgage, food, or their own personal needs. These are challenges, obviously, that affect every corner of the country, not just Toronto. And so for those reasons, when we look at an increase, I'll give you a simple example of a 70-cent increase in the price of diesel. I mean, everyone focuses on gasoline, that's great, it's up 40 cents, but diesel is the global workhorse of our economy. And when that price goes up, it has enormous impacts, especially when it's also meanders into the area of natural gas. Natural gas, which is a feedstock, not just for keeping us warm in winters, but for industrial purposes, and of course for urea, for fertilizers. And of course what's happened in the Persian Gulf should be of grave concern as we head towards, in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere, towards planting season. Also the impacts of things like polyurethane, which very few people give consideration to. Got a memo the other day from Dow Chemical and Lion Blaisdell saying that they are going to increase by 60% the cost of plastics. What does that mean? Well, medical products all the way to construction products, even some of the food industry will be affected by this. So there are a number of layers to the implications of disruptions in the energy field, which will have enormous consequences for me. Judging by my girth, food is most important. And for that reason, I think it's extraordinarily significant that the timing in which we discuss this isn't just about, you know, a group of 50, 60, 70 and watching us as well on TV, but this will have wide implications for the country, for all of North America. And I suspect that with fertilizer shortages coming in Europe and Asia in the not too distant future, we are going to be looking at a number of nations knocking on Canada's door, and nations that do have energy to be able to provide whatever they can to get them over this hump created by this massive geopolitical event, which I call nothing short of an energy crisis that has consequences, especially for food.
Oh, Dan, thank you very much for introducing the large-scale kind of structural context in which we meet today. I'm wondering, Carolyn, whether you'd like to share now your opening statement.
For sure. So just to give everyone a little bit of context, I'll move down a little bit to look at, given our focus as an organization is provincial in structure. So we service food banks in the province. So we're seeing firsthand the impacts localized at the individual level of what policies, both income policies, environmental policies, broader economic impacts happen on the ground for individuals in need. Our role is both to provide programs and services for food banks, but also to do advocacy and research on what's driving people to food banks in the first place and what we can do to change that. And ultimately, what we know is that right now, food security is getting out of control. It was already an issue, and it's grown exponentially. In the last 5 years, we've seen food bank use grow 165%. We're now serving over 1 million people each year, unique, and they're visiting 8.7 million times. That is just the tip of the iceberg, because the remainder of folks are food insecure, but they're just not visiting our services yet. And what we know is when food bank visits go up, healthcare dependency goes up. When food bank visits go up, more people become unhoused. When food bank visits go up, there's increased social unrest. And so all of these implications are not just about people, one, going out without food every day, which is a huge issue, but beyond that, the interconnectedness, as Dan was speaking to, is what we're seeing on the ground. For us, for those that visit food banks, you know, a third of them are children, 60% of adults are on some form of social assistance, so whether that be OW or ODSP, and 25% are employed. So if we're seeing 25% of people who are accessing jobs, who have jobs, but still needing to access a food bank to get by, what does that tell us about the state of the economy? What does that tell us about cost of living, the cost of food, and to be able to afford your most basic necessities? So for us, our policy focuses on a few key areas, primarily given 60% of those that we support are on social assistance. Right now, that's where we're focusing on, because policies have not aligned. And so we're thinking directly with food, but what we don't remember is that a lot of the policies that we have are 20 years old. So they don't reflect the job market of today. They don't reflect the cost of living of today, and they don't reflect the housing market of today. So the example I'm gonna give is something like Ontario Works. You're allowed to earn $200 in income outside of Ontario Works. that the amount of hours with minimum wage that you could work 10 years ago to earn $200 versus today is a lot shorter. It's disincentivizing work. People are scared to go back to work because they don't want to lose income and they don't want to lose their supports through social assistance. And what does that have to do with food? Well, ultimately, people are choosing to go without food so they can afford all their most basic necessities. Food bank clients spend, on average, 70% of their income on rent alone, so that leaves 30% for everything else. So you can imagine for transit, coats for your kids this winter, medicine if you have a medical issue, your car breaks down, you need something extra that month, there's no way you're meeting that. And so what we're seeing is the true result of food insecurity is that it's actually income insecurity is what we're seeing, and food is just a reflection of that. And so for us, the biggest indicator is how do we get a very complex system to work together and pull a number of different policy levers at the same time to have impact. There is no silver bullet. We know that very clearly. But we know there are, as Canada and a country of incrementalism, that there is a lot of policy options that are available for us to pull to start to turn the tide on this, particularly as we're growing with a number of challenges. Because very soon, food banks, which are being relied on to support a second-tier food system instead of dealing with the social policies that we need, are going to collapse. We are not meant to support a system like this. We've grown, they're doing the best with what they can, but with the realities that we're seeing broadly and internationally, the result is if we can't serve them, they're going to become unhoused. And then we have a much bigger public health problem on our hands. And so with that, I will pause.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you also for reminding us, in such kind of clear and powerful ways what the stakes are for individuals, not just for this kind of broader, more abstract system. Now, I'm curious now to ask Jo Sharma for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Dan and Carolyn, can everyone hear me?
It may be best, especially for those at home, to use the mic. And it is meant to be more like a lollipop than
Okay, is it on?
Cone.
Yes.
Okay. Nah, it's fine. Thanks. I'm just balancing a lot of stuff because I don't have a good head for figures. Yeah, shocking though they are. So thanks so much. I'm going to riff a little bit off what my colleagues have said, but also perhaps over what was discussed at the previous panel, because yes.
If you want to tilt the mic a little bit, so that would be better for those at home.
So thanks so much. So I'm going to speak first about Toronto and then maybe talk a little bit about, other contexts. So I'm actually using the amazing data from Daily Bread, the Hunger Report, which I should recommend if, people are not familiar with it. It's depressing reading, but every November I do highlight it and use it in my classes, because they do an amazing job pulling together all the data, but also it really is something that is extremely easy. They even do a video of it, because I think part of what we're talking about to the systemic issues, I would add the real need for youth in particular to, engage. And not just as panels like this, but to vote. Because one of the reasons we have systemic issues that do not get addressed generation after generation, because when people vote or do not vote, these issues do not get raised. And I think, one of the reasons I'm an educator, one of the reasons I teach about food, one of the reasons I, come to panels like this is to say that every one of us has a platform, and especially youth. And if we can take some of the insights, some of the discussions we do today, I think that would be a much better use of everyone's time than anything we can say today. Because as Carolyn said, there are no silver bullets. But one of the things that we do have, all of us, is hope that things could be better, right? So let's go to from the good stuff to the bad stuff. So yes, as Carolyn mentioned, and relying on Daily Bread's figures, between 2019 to 2025, you had a 340% rise in the number of food bank visits. And Carolyn is absolutely right that, do not actually, that doesn't count. The people who are not going to food banks, who are relying on other forms of assistance. It's like the invisible side, right? But if we disaggregate that further, of the 1 in every 10 Torontonians who are, whether reliant on food banks or going there a couple of times a month, 1 in 4 are kids. And that's something that actually could be redressed a little bit. Also, 35% in the city of Toronto and, counting the GTA, who are going, are people who are in multiple jobs. And that is a big change. And, I talk regularly with the 35 groups who are part of the Scarborough Food Network. And that is, again, a tangible change that they've seen, starting from around the pandemic onwards, that it is people who are working multiple jobs, in fact, people who have post-secondary degrees and so on. That's one of the biggest rises, right? And therefore, it will not surprise us because 88% of the folks who are visiting food banks also have housing issues, right? And that is where, while there is no silver bullet, there are policy changes that could be made. And again, we just have a little time to discuss here, but I would invite everyone to actually look at the very plausible, tangible measures, that the Hunger Report invites everyone who's a citizen to take part in. And part of it is that we've had so for over 10 years, I've been working, with our wonderful partners in the Coalition for Healthy School Food. And speaking as a new Canadian, when I came to this country and when I started being a professor here and working in food, I was absolutely shocked, coming from the global south as I did, to hear that Canada, a wealthy country like Canada, did not have school food programs. And this came... this is illustrated in so many different ways, but one of the ways I remember is that when the pandemic started, because I work on cities across the world, I remember reading how in Chicago and New York, and believe me, I do not usually look to the US for progressive social measures. However, in Chicago and New York, they had to pivot to making sure that, families whose kids were getting at least a school lunch every day, that they were ensuring that somehow those families could come and pick up those lunches when schools were closed because, of the pandemic measures. And then I turned to our partners here and I heard from, a few community groups, for instance, the Boys and Girls Club of Scarborough, that they were putting those measures. But that is not what they are supposed to be doing, right? So that is a systemic measure. So after that, we had the mandate. For the first time, we had a federal mandate on the National School Food Program. But that has not gone very far. And again, these are tangible measures. And also these need to be these cannot be partisan measures. It cannot be reliant on one, party following the other, right? But this is where citizens can make a difference. And it is where, we all know the really low rate of electoral participation, right? Especially from university students. And so I would say that we can only address food insecurity when we actually do our bit as citizens. Yes, we should talk about things like the student nutrition program. We should, ask for renter safeguards and so on, a whole lot of things that I'm sure have already come up. But unless we have greater engagement from all citizens, particularly the youth, and college students can lead the way, nothing's going to change. Thank you.
There you go. Thank you very much. And now I'll proceed to one question per panelist. We have some personalized questions to get us going from here. I'd like to first ask Dan a question about the state of food security in Canada in different areas of the country, because it may be true here in Ontario, it might not necessarily be the case, say, in Atlantic Canada or up north. Dan, if you'd like to comment on that.
It's an excellent question, Bennett, and my understanding is only because I do a lot of interviews coast to coast, recently especially. But there are significant differences where it may be seen as bad in Toronto or the GTA or the 905, 416 or the Golden Horseshoe. There are places in Northern Ontario where the cost of food, access to quality, nutritional food is just not available. Newfoundland, which has to pretty much bring its product by ship, which arrives daily to St. John coming from Nova Scotia or from New Brunswick. means that the cost of food there is much higher than it is, generally speaking, in more urban places in the country. Western Canada seems to be doing a little bit better. Tom could speak to me on this better, much better than I could, the Manitoban situation, but I can say from the perspective of Alberta and Saskatchewan, these are concerns, but not to the extent that they are here in Toronto. British Columbia, yes, of course, the cost of everything, and especially in Vancouver, is through the roof. I don't know how people survive in that part of the world, and we're not just talking housing, but the cost even of fuel. $2.10 for a liter of gasoline when it's still $1.75 here. Take your pick in terms of how the further north we go. We know there are, in certain places of the country, there are concessions the federal government gives, especially to our native communities, which are isolated in many respects. It's what comes on the next shipment, on the next plane, is really the way in which they acquire the nutrition, the food that they need. And is it little wonder that in many of those places we are falling behind and affecting, as has been suggested here, the plight of children in particular. So I think it's really a checkerboard in Canada. Some regions, we're all not happy about the price of, we call it in French, des alimentations. We're not happy about the cost of food, but there are regions in this country which are far worse off, and that has to be addressed as a fundamental cohesive policy by the federal government. I know they are trying, but there are efforts that really have to recognize, first of all, and bring to Toronto the magnitude of the problem beyond our borders, beyond our region, because I think a lot of Canadians are suffering.
Well, thank you very much. Now, my next question is for Carolyn Stewart to ask a little bit more about food banks and about what role you see food banks playing in perhaps a more complete, more sustainable national strategy for food security in Canada. How can we leverage food banks appropriately, and perhaps even more importantly, how can we organize a response to food security in Canada such that they are perhaps not so prominent? What do you think, Carolyn Stewart?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'd like to say is that food banks are not a solution, very explicitly, that we are not a solution to food insecurity, nor have we ever said that we were. So we are an emergency mechanism for an emergency need, and we should be one component of a response. And so what we need to remember is that long-term, in order to reduce the need for food security or for food banks, is through good social policy. So as I spoke about, for us, it's really focused on three key areas, one being housing, and I think I probably don't need to get into that given the policy talk you just had, but the housing need is driving what we're seeing at food banks exponentially. There's low housing stock. We've stopped building purpose-built housing. The cost of rent, yes, one piece, but just even availability and accessibility across the province, particularly in northern and rural communities, is a huge issue. On top of that, the type of jobs and quality jobs that we're getting, we're seeing that drive food bank use. As I said, there's 25% of people that are accessing food banks that are employed. But beyond that, the majority, we're seeing a growth in gig employment. And when we're talking about gig employment, they're not covered by the Employment Standards Act, nor do they qualify for the right way in EI. EI was built at a time when everyone worked for the same job for 40 years and they work 9 to 5. They bank those hours and go home and do the right thing. But when you're working 3 jobs and 2 of them are gig jobs and they don't count towards your hours, you can't access. You're working, you're contributing to the economy, but you can't access the program that's meant to protect you in times of hardship. So we need to make sure that our systems and our policies are reflective of the today, right? When we're having workers who are working and there's a complete job market occurring outside of the systems that are meant to protect us, it means that when hard times come, like we're seeing right now, there are no protections and there are no safety nets, and that drives people to use food banks. And then finally, I talked a little bit about social assistance programs. The Ontario Disability Support Program, Ontario Works here. If you're on Ontario Works, you get $733 a month, and you're disincentivized to work. But there are so many people that are fearful of losing potentially their secure housing that we talked about, so they don't want to get off the program. They're fearful of taking too many hours because their guaranteed income is going to get cut back. Or they have health problems and they get health support on Ontario Works, so they don't want to leave the program because they want to continue to receive health supports. So all of these things are systems that were built at a time that they think they're disincentivizing chronic use, but when in fact, They're disincentivizing people from getting back into the job market. And we need people to work. We need more people to work so they had sufficient income, because ultimately being food secure means being able to access the food you need in the way you need it, at the time you need it, in the volume you need it. And that's not how people are accessing food here in Canada. And so ultimately, if we're looking for long-term, we really need to look at a diverse, as I said, set of policy levers. And in some circumstances, they don't need to be massive overhauls of systems. They can be small incremental changes that allow for more flexibility to reflect the realities of today. But ultimately, what we're seeing, I think a few different things that we're seeing, the commitment to the government getting back into housing building, which I know can be a bit controversial depending on who you are, but we stopped building 40 years ago, and we're dealing with the results of that now. We don't have, I think earlier we were talking in the other room about duplexes and quadplexes and the diversity and type of housing that we have here. We have to be innovative and think outside the box to be able to get people housed, because ultimately we know at food banks, getting people housed is the first stage of getting people up and being able to be food secure. Without housing, everything else doesn't matter. You cannot do it. And so I think what we need to remember is ultimately food banks are not going to solve this problem. We're going to continue to advocate for policies in those three areas that really will ultimately get there. But I would echo Dr. Sharma and say it's about collective will to get there, and thinking about things a little bit differently when it comes to policy to make sure that we can get there. And so I'll pause there to make sure we have time for other things.
No, that's excellent. No, thank you very much. And in particular, I very much appreciate, this kind of powerful example of, as we say, prevention is better than a cure. And I think that's very much the case in this context too. Now, I'd love to ask Joe Sharma our next question, because I know your area of focus is sort of the municipal environment, urban environment, cities. I'm curious to ask what you might like to share about how Canadian cities are engaging with food security, how maybe they can do so a little bit more successfully at this municipal level.
If I may, I'm actually going to jump over Canadian cities, come back to them, but perhaps go to some examples, because one of the things I do is that I direct the Feeding City Lab, and we do look at infrastructure and solutions, policies across the world. And so, okay, so let me take an example of a city in the global south, which is Sao Paulo in Brazil. And so one of the things that could put into place during the pandemic was an institution that we do have in a different form here, but run entirely at a community level, but really no state governance support, which are solidarity kitchens. And those who are interested can actually go to our podcast, Voices from the Food Frontlines, and listen to the podcast that we brought from Sao Paulo. And the interesting thing is that this was something that was happening during the pandemic as a kind of pivot during the pandemic. A group of folks, so it was a community organization, Quembada Alimentada, that did that in partnership with restaurants, with chefs, and with support from the provincial government. But what happened since? That has actually now become part of federal policy, right? And the solidarity kitchens, which, are working to redress food insecurity in specific cities and neighborhoods, are also now part of a larger canvas, which is being applied federally, but in tandem with provinces and cities. And that is the kind of intervention that's needed. But then we can think about, I mentioned school food policies. So if we look at other cities, whether in East Asia or in Europe, where some of our work has gone, is that when you put in place, say, a school food policy, when you're procuring for schools, old age homes, and I'll take a very specific example here, the small city of Malmö in southern Sweden. Because the Malmö Food Policy Council worked with the municipal government, and what they have in place is an excellent policy that has been going on for over a decade now of public procurement. What it basically means is that this is a small city. It's really, really small compared to Toronto. But because they procure, for all these different institutions, is they have a budget of 30 million euros every year, which immediately makes them a really, really big buyer, right? And it really shocked me because they're actually able to provide 60 to 70% of organic fresh foods because they have that kind of buying power. So we are not talking about, rich Scandinavians and so on. We're just talking about, and we have an excellent example right here in Ontario. Can anyone tell me what I'm talking about? Public procurement? I don't work in wine, but the LCBO. So I've, gone all over Italy in the tiniest little place. They all know the LCBO, right? Because the LCBO is one of the biggest buyers in the world. And, one can talk about all kinds of different things, but the fact is that is the kind of public procurement model. And so I would invite all of you to join our visitor, Raj Patel, who has been advising the Mamdani government in New York, and who's going to be talking about public grocery stores, to basically talk about how one strategy can be to actually intervene in supply chains. But before we get there, and this may be because, I'm a new Canadian, but actually I do most of my shopping at the Italian store down the road, or at the Chinese and the Middle Eastern stores down the road. I live on the Danforth, and I have the great good fortune of being able to walk down the street and buy my food. I very, very rarely go to, Loblaws or No Frills. I don't drive, but I can walk down the store and I can go to the kind of infrastructure that we have. And so we're not talking about just public infrastructure. These are private businesses, but they are businesses. And I talk to them and they tell us, and these are part of the solutions we can put in place to actually provide, concessions, incentives, the tax credits and so on for these stores, as they already are doing, but in a more systematic way, to be able to work with food banks, to be able to work with, and that is how we can break the kind of stranglehold over supply chains that unfortunately the big four supermarkets have, right? And that is what I mean by going beyond the Canadian example and looking to what works in different parts of the world, being agile and adopting those solutions, which we should be doing at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels. Thank you.
Excellent. So thank you very much for that kind of comparative look at what places beyond this nation are doing when it comes to food security, especially at the municipal level. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit now and open up these questions moving forward to all the panelists, because I'm hopeful we can speak a little bit to current affairs, perhaps a little bit, as disasters and conflicts and climate change disrupt growing seasons, harvests, and food diversity, as well as the transportation of food. I'm curious to ask for some thoughts on how rural and urban Canadians can perhaps future-proof their food systems today. Is there anything they can do? What can they do?
I mean, I can talk a little bit about, so we work heavily with the Ministry of Emergency Preparedness, so EMO, a ministry, and this is because the amount of emergencies that exists in the province are growing exponentially every year. So we are responding particularly for northern remote fly-in communities, more rural. They're dealing with, because of climate change, increased flooding, longer fire seasons. Even last April, we experienced that ice storm, if we all recall, and the areas of Kawartha Lakes was completely out of power for 5 days. Many people, were without food. Seniors who live rurally were completely isolated and no access to food. So sometimes we think about food security. Access is a very key piece, and so there's a growing need for this type of response. And so I guess I would say my biggest fear is that there is no future-proofing because of the constant volatility of the system, but being prepared helps to do that. So we're part of something called the Ontario Core, which works with the ministry and does different parts. So there's someone who goes in and digs out seniors who are rural and isolated and delivers food. We prepare emergency food boxes to make sure that we can provide access. So making sure that there's preparation. I would also argue diversity helps with sustainability long term. So reliance on single systems is where we always run into problems. And so for us, when in the nonprofit sector, we've been advocating for diversity of food sources. I mean, we can even see now, you know, with the global conflict that's happening right now, the limitation of imports that we're relying on, and now seeing the true results of from a food security sourcing perspective, or if we were even remember COVID-19 in those first, you know, few months when we were going into shelves and shelves were completely bare. Because even when we go back to things like the cost of packaging is going to be going up shortly, that they can't get the proper, you know, packaging for canning, even something as simple as that. We're looking at cost of food, but the supply chain for food security is so broad. And we forget about the global impact. And so for me, I think it's always one, preparation. What is it, an ounce of pepper? There's that age-old adage, I can't remember it is, a pound of...
Well, they say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for. But that's most definitely, I think, the case. And diversity to create sustainability is the best way around it because we're seeing the true realities on the ground right now.
Thank you so much. Do Dan McTeague or Joe Sharma have other thoughts to share on this?
Thank you. So I did want to go back actually to the pandemic context because we just, you know, are wrapping up a study, and this has been done in connection with my colleague, Dr. Sarah Elton. And in fact, one of the ways in which I'll differ a bit is to say that while we had shortages, in Toronto, we were actually far more resilient, and that's because we have two things. One of them I've already referred to, which is our network of, you know, I hate the term, but that's what most people call them, the ethnic stores, you know, from the Italian to the Chinese to the little Mid-Eastern stores, which operate in a different type of supply chains. And many of them actually operate through the Ontario Food Terminal. And so when you had, you know, the kind of big supermarket supply chains being disrupted, you actually had the Ontario Food Terminal and these networks operating. And that is where I realized, you know, that neighbors of mine who had never been to Chinatown before were suddenly going there. However, the Ontario Food Terminal, again, and I can tell you since I'm a newspaper junkie, is that almost was closed down. Because it happens to be on prime urban land, and it actually took a public campaign. It took a lot of, you know, kind of things to come into place for the terminal to be kept, right? And that is where, you know, rather than thinking that, hey, this is something that works, let's think of how we can extend it, strengthen it, and, you know, think about resilience is, you know, hey, that's very, very valuable land, let's, you know, get hold of that land and turn it. So that is not a housing solution because, you know, it's not going to turn into affordable housing. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing I want to go back to is, in fact, to go beyond food, to think about if you grow food, what do you need? You need fertilizer. So again, that's where I think this is also the opportunity to talk about the folks who are not using those kinds of fertilizers. And actually, you know, one good thing is that the federal government has promised to put research money towards looking at other kinds. So one of the things that I've started to look into is basically fungal solutions, which allow for ways of growing which are not dependent on those phosphate-based fertilizers, you know, all kinds of other things, but to get back to seeds. And that is where, again, we have a lot of amazing work being done by smaller community-based groups, by research groups, about Seed Alliance, Seed Change, and so on. But that needs to come into a national strategy because I can tell you right away, we are not resilient. We are actually dependent on the US for most of our seeds. And given the way that the political scenario is going, I'm really, really afraid of a scenario where Canada is actually choked off of seeds. And that is where we can bring rural Canada back in, right? That there is no reason why there cannot be, you know, something like the Victory Garden strategy of an earlier era, which can be actually to grow seeds and to keep, you know, develop a medium strategy for seed resilience along with food resilience. And that's where we need to think about diversity, not just in terms of supply chains for food, but what actually food comes from, which is seeds. Thank you.
Thank you. And
I'm just going to say it's an excellent point. I mean, we still have to ask the permission of the Monsantos and the Cargills of this world to do that, and that brings a number of copyright issues to play. But there are also a number of other areas that we have to, if this is our priority, food security, then we have to be adult enough to begin the discussions on the things that are contributing to higher prices. And I don't just mean energy, but something that I rarely see discussed. In my many interviews, I almost have to get those interviewing me, gong them with the idea, the Canadian dollar. We no longer have the status as a petrodollar. Well, big deal. Who cares about energy? We just leave it in the ground. That's nice. But when it costs 139 cents to buy $1 US, that adds 37 cents to the price of diesel and gasoline. And given that 20 to 30% of our foods are, given their climate, are imported from the United States, it has a real damaging effect on affordability. We also have to be able to have open discussions about supply management. I mean, when you take, I come from an era when you didn't dump your milk away, you didn't throw your lunch in the garbage pail, and people who did were a little bizarre, but it seems that something's incongruent. We have poverty in the midst of plenty as it relates to food. We have tons of food, but we don't seem to be able to get it to people, and those who are getting it, are having a real go of it to try to afford this. At the same time, we have a system that was created back, I remember Eugene Whalen is in the same building I was in saying, it's a great system, it's a wonderful system, it creates quality. Who needs the Americans? It'll protect farmers. When that started, there was 30,000, 40,000 farmers who were dairy farmers in Canada. There's probably about 12,000, 13,000 today. That doesn't mean they can't scale up. I say the same thing for refineries. You don't need as many as long as you can scale up. But there is, something has gone off the rails. In my time, it used to be concentration in the downstream of the grocery sector and the abuses that they were heaping on it. I mentioned at the outset on suppliers, slotting fees, co-op allowances, these types of things, which someone has to pay for. If you want to get that aisle level purchase, you have to pay, to get to basically to have real estate in a large shopping center. There's of course many others that will compete, but there are some things here that we cannot walk away from, and I think we have to have a serious modern discussion about whether these things are working or not, because the evidence is very clear. With food insecurity on the rise, the #1 issue in Canada of affordability, it's something we can no longer ignore.
Thank you very much to all. And I do very much appreciate this talk about independence and kind of self-sufficiency, or at least some shade of it, because, of course, each of us exists in our own kind of online, personalized ecosystems. And one thing that I've been encountering of late is there are folks who fantasize about developing kind of a mini farm for themselves, turning their backyards into, very cleanly organized spaces where they can grow potatoes and cabbage and things like that. Now, but this does inspire, a more kind of serious question about the role, the potential role, perhaps, of smaller scale agriculture, rooftop farms, community gardens, or even futuristic advances like perhaps vertical farms in certain areas. Do these, in your estimation, this is a question, of course, for all of you, have a role to play realistically in feeding populations today?
I mean, so the short answer, no. I think they have a purpose in the broader food system, both in terms of innovation, creating a connection to agriculture, but if we're talking about the scale of agriculture that Dan was just talking about, it's incredibly expensive to become a farmer. I don't know if people know that to start a farm or to get into farming is incredibly expensive. So for any Canadians that were looking to start into farming at any scale, we want to make it, one, approachable, but also affordable for them to be able to scale up the need. But when we're talking for the food secure issue, I'll go back to, it's not a supply issue. We've never had a supply issue. We're very fortunate to live in Canada. I think we do need to continue, as Dr. Sharma said, to work through diversity, growing our own, get back into manufacturing. But if we're talking about food security at the individual level, it's an income problem and an access problem, not a volume problem. But that's, yeah, I'll let.
I absolutely agree that it is, a distribution problem. And I did see, I might be preempting it, but you did have, questions about lab-grown meat and so on. And, we could talk about that, but ultimately there is no point if you're producing things which people can't afford. Right? So it is a distribution problem. And again, we are ultimately a wealthy country. It is a problem of distribution. It is a problem of, the wrong kind of monopolies and so on. But I want to just track back to something. When I talk about resilience, especially of seeds, I don't mean that we should go and get permission from Monsanto and Cargill and so on. Trust me, I work on other areas of the world where there have been thousands and thousands of farmer suicides simply because of dependence on Monsanto. And given that the government down south has just passed something which, makes it clear that Roundup is now, in fact, beyond the reach of any lawsuits. So I don't think we're going there. In fact, we need to develop a strategy of seed resilience, which means that farmers, whether they be urban farmers or rural farmers, are not having to pay Monsanto and Cargill for permission to use their own seeds. That is what was the case, right? So there's a certain continuity there. But, and again, I will differ a little bit from Caroline because no, I don't believe that urban agriculture, community-based agriculture can meet the food needs of the entire city of Toronto. But it definitely plays a role, and I would say that it is also tied to the issue of food waste, because that is the other thing. Whether at the individual level and the collective level, and Dan did allude to some of it, is that there's a huge amount of food waste that goes on. And we could, again, I don't want to get started on hobby horses, but this is where sometimes I thank my stars. I grew up in the global south, and even though I refused to learn to cook at home for other gendered reasons, definitely I picked up. And, I keep telling my teenagers around me, I'm like, you have to eat rice and lentils, because otherwise you're going to go to starve at university, right? So food waste, food literacy, but also what I would call the growing mentality. Everyone can grow like a pot of herbs on their windowsill. You don't need a garden. And part of what it does is that it also teaches you to value food. And I think that is part of what because on the one hand, we have food insecurity, but also we have this kind of lack of value of food, of different types of food. Right? And again, I don't want to, this is not a situation where we kind of blame the victims. But again, if you eat meat, buy a whole chicken and learn to cut it, even if you're doing it badly, and it can actually feed you for a whole week. And that is still being done. But that is where I think, again, it is a holistic scenario. And what I see with the tremendous work that, community groups do, and I'm talking about all kinds of groups because I've worked for 5 years with, the number of organizations that are working, in the Scarborough Food Network, but also, in other parts of the GTA, is that it is a combination of these different things. There's a community garden at Access Alliance on the rooftop of the Danforth, and that community garden is one where people go to grow together. It doesn't, supply them, say, with the staples, but it supplies them with the vegetables and herbs and so on. And that, in turn, brings what I would also call culturally relevant foods. And that is where, you need food security, but you also need people to kind of be aware of food sovereignty. And so that's where I will differ a little bit, because I think if we just go back to, that kind of thing that, yes, you give people those basics and, it'll be enough. It won't be enough, because then they won't value food. They will not value, the fact that the seeds that you're growing are ones that have been manipulated and, owned by a really, really conscienceless, multinational. And so I think that is where, if we talk about food security strategies, we have to talk about resilience, we have to talk about diversity, all types of diversities, and we have to talk about food sovereignty. Sorry, probably went on for too long.
No, that's excellent. In fact, the timing is perfect, because even though we have more questions we will ask our panelists, we also want to open the floor to questions from the audience, which we will do now. We have one question. We have maybe someone with a mic, or maybe not right now. I will maybe run with a mic. Yeah, sounds good to me. So I'm going to run over here to first. My friend Monty, I'll pass the mic to you.
Monty McMurtry, many years in post-conflict development. As with the first panel, you have summed up the issue is precarity and also what I call the corrosive nature in the human spirit. And I'm going to talk about feeding the children in school. It should be ubiquitous because children are very sensitive. If they're not nourished, it affects the brain structure and that migrates into crime. And also children are very intuitive because they all need to be treated equally because some may be more affluent. So if it's going to be done for one, it needs to be done for everyone in the junior school system. And then dealing with Monsanto in Africa, that is a political pernicious problem and that has literally destroyed the African infrastructure in several countries. And so my question is how can we how can we manifest in terms of what I call our collective civics? Because it's all interrelated. Health, food, and housing. You cannot have one without the other. It's almost cascading. And I remember the 1995 provincial election, the common sense revolution, which literally destroyed so much. And then the individual who was the progenitor of that went on to manage for-profit senior citizen homes and the destruction. So it's a question of what I call ethical value. It's a question of morality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any comments on these?
I know we have some folks from OISE here, and in fact, that is where I think we get back to education. I teach a class, which I will be happy to say, we have 200 students every year. It's called Foods That Change the World. And I talk about many of those issues there. I would love to work with educationists because I think that is a basic, lesson which can be there at schools, starting with elementary schools, and that indeed is what is being done in other countries. It might shock you to know, I was shocked when I heard that there was about quite a few years ago, a scheme to actually basically flood the school food procurement in Korea with, antibiotic-laden American meat. It was stopped. It was stopped by a coalition of parents and little children, right? So these are not very complex issues. So that's where I think we need to not have these silos, but to have people who work on education, coming together, people who work, say, on food and housing.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a hand over here, and we also have a mic, so please go on.
Tom Max for the Massey College. So two questions. So Carolyn, you mentioned a very dire prediction that food banks may actually collapse. And if you had a moment, I'd like just to hear more about that. It's like emergency rooms, I assume, that demand is so great and so on, but just a little bit more about that because that's pretty crucial. The second thing I wanted to raise, and perhaps Dan might respond to this, one of the great issues that we have in the country around food and food security is that we have increasing divides between urban and rural Canada. And before I came, my dad was a farmer, and before I came to the University of Toronto, I taught many years at Queen's. And we had a really active local food movement around Kingston. And we wanted Queen's dorms to use local food and not to bring it in from the States and to have more local markets. And it increased diversity, but also there was a lot of contacts then between students from around Ontario and farmers from Eastern Ontario. And that was mutually interesting, sometimes adversarial, certainly informative. So I wonder, that's just one example from Kingston, but the local food movements, greenhouses, local supplies, as opposed to just bringing it into Loblaws, is that not possibly a larger piece of this problem? So, emergency issue, and what can we do locally a little bit to get over the urban-rural divide by putting some real encouragement for local markets and local food?
So I'm often the advocate of doom. So I don't like to be that person. But what I mean when I say that is right now what we're seeing, like food banks. In my time with Feed Ontario, I'm hitting 16 years. When I started, it was about 200,000 unique individuals accessing food banks. Now we're at over 1 million, visiting almost 9 million times. And that's just the most in need. And food banks are already having to respond by reducing services. So you used to be able to come once a week. Now you can come twice a month. They used to provide more wraparound supports, so just not emergency food, but other supports. They can't provide those anymore. You used to pay 7 days worth of food. Now they're providing 5. So we're not going to see a shut your door overnight type thing, but we can see the cracks in the foundation. And so, we feel like we're screaming into the ether, kind of saying, the emergency mechanism is about to fail. And for us, our biggest concern is that we've done research. There's a few studies, one out of the University of Calgary, and there's one out of McMaster as well, that indicates that food banks are the last line of defense before people become homeless. So because there's food banks, they can pay their rent and stay housed. So if food banks are no longer able to serve people, that is our biggest concern, is the ripple. And if anyone knows a little bit about the housing continuum, to run people further up the housing continuum, it gets increasingly difficult the further down you get. And so, as I said earlier, keeping people housed is vital in so many respects, both from a healthcare perspective, but food, having access to food, but just safety, community safety, right? And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the cracks in the foundation, and so we are trying to make sure that we can start to see the change before things get any worse. Is what we're saying. But particularly when we're talking about rural communities or northern or flying communities, I mean, it's bad. It's really bad. And the results is to kind of go into your second question before I let other people answer, I think there's a lot of cool, innovative ways to look at solutions between urban and rural. I work with a collective called Witchawaymagon, which is First Nations collectives as well as nonprofits and government in northwestern Ontario. And we've been trying to help support access to remote communities. And part of it is the monopoly of the northern stores in allowing access to food. So they're actually now working, Sobeys has actually allowed them to now purchase wholesale through their distribution center for Northwest. And we're working to help provide at-cost shipping, because the transportation is the key expense, to be able to provide communities with low cost or lower cost food. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for cross-pollination across sectors that allow for that to happen. And the only reason it happened is because someone was willing to try. And so I think there's a lot, we also have a food bank in North York here called and they're operating a social enterprise called Food Reach. So they actually do collective buying on behalf of nonprofits and education systems to keep the price low, to allow for more people to access support. So, but for us, I think accessibility, especially as stores and distribution changes for rural communities, we're going to see the true reality and need, again, more innovation changes on how we approach food distribution.
Thank you so much. Yeah, would Dan like to comment on now that second part of the question?
I think the point is that there has been a refocus and orientation of a lot of the farming communities, whether it's Western Canada or even Southwestern Ontario, towards a much larger supply chain, as opposed to looking, specifically. I grew up working in Leamington, Ontario. We pick tomatoes, we pick potatoes for the local plant, the Heinz, H.J. Heinz. And so that was in the time where that product was meant and focused, including the champignon mushrooms, including fish from homesteads, whatever the case may be. It was always for a more local market. And I think that's why we had that sort of ability to say, yes, we can reach into those places. I have a very good friend, my very best friend's wife, works at the food bank in Conestoga in Kitchener. Says, we bring in and we get some farmers who have excess and they bring it in, but you bring a couple of barrels full of cabbage. Folks who are coming there, particularly students, may not even know how to cook these things, much less understand their relevance, much less their quality. They may be older and in many respects not well used. But specifically to your point about bridging the divide, we have this massive supply chain issue that has sort of where we have some acting as gatekeepers as to what is being brought back into the cities, what can be diverted to the cities, what can be kept where rural communities can be seen part of the ability to contribute to and to help those in bigger cities, larger cities, get access to decent food. They produce it, why not have it that way? But the orientation has changed so much. I'm from Manitoba as well, so families who lived in Dauphin, they're not even producing anymore. They've come to much larger organizations. I talked to some pork farmers in Stratford, Ontario back a few months ago. They said, you know, in the past 20 years, we are so big. We've accumulated X thousands. We have hogs going everywhere, and our market is no longer Canada. Our market could be China, or it could be South Korea, or it could be Japan. We don't know. And so the willingness, the ability to help is somewhat circumvented by the realities of bigger than big corporate organizations.
Okay, so we have time for, I think, just one more question, one more response. We have someone with a mic already, so... Oh, really? Okay, very good. Okay, excellent. Oh, I thought we were done at 12:20. Okay, excellent. Well, we have time for both. Look at that. Excellent. So we'll start with you, my friend, and then we'll move over.
All right, so I got 15 minutes to ask a question. My name is Don Gibson, and this is sparked by Dr. Sharma, actually. You briefly talked about rooftop gardening, and I'm fortunate to live in the city and have a garden and a yard. And over the last decade or so, we've gone much more into vegetables. So we've got 4 vegetable boxes we built that are roughly 4 feet by 10 feet, okay? So it's not a huge amount. I'm astonished year by year of just how much we can grow. And I was intrigued to hear recently that the City of Toronto was building incentives into new builds to have rooftop gardening. And yet discover that the Ontario government has overridden many of that. And so I'd just like I'd like to hear from further about the rooftop gardening and what needs to be done clearly to break that kind of logjam and allow for more.
Is it on?
Just want to make sure.
Yeah. So yes, so I'm actually happy to send you the information. I'm part of a project called TO Sustain, where a number of us scientists as well as social scientists are working together looking at sustainable agriculture for the GTA. And part of it is looking at rooftop agriculture. And in fact, if you just look over at Trinity, some of the beds are there. But this kind of policy NIMBYism is exactly, part of what we were talking about, and that is where we need to have a clear set of, objectives, and where these strategies, which are needed on the housing front, which are needed on the food front, need to be there. So that is where, you can also provide incentives, right? But you're absolutely right. It cannot be done just at the municipal level, it has to be on the provincial, the federal level. The other thing which I was so disappointed last year got killed is, again, I had seen in places, all over the world, is the use of like small solar panels. And in fact, it might shock you that Pakistan, which is a country which, has a lot of insecurity and so on, is not suffering as badly as one might think, simply because since the power grid was already so bad there, a lot of people were using those cheap solar panels, and that's the case in Africa as well, right? But last year, essentially with the new government that came in, one of those subsidies and, kind of incentives that are being provided to manufacturers. So that's where it needs to be the big picture, that these are the kinds of technologies, these are the kinds of policies that will encourage. So if you are a developer, if you're building condos, then you will actually get an incentive if you put an edible green roof on top, rather than, all those green roofs we see, which are actually not green, because it's, so that is the kind of thing. And you're absolutely right. Rooftops, parking spaces, these are all the kind of spaces that are there. And it has to go together with, I talked about public procurement, to kind of link together. So instead of throwing the excess milk, maybe you have an incentive to donate it, but also to think about the kind of transport issues.
There you go. We can add so much value to things we already have. Just takes a little bit of creativity, a little bit of initiative. Thank you so much. Now we have one more question over here.
Hi, my name's Gerard Kennedy. I ran the first food bank in the country way long time ago, and was an MP and an MPP. I guess what I'd like to contribute and then see the reaction of the panelists is, the question is really about hunger. Hunger will organize what we do. People should not go hungry. in this country. There isn't one viable excuse for it. So food, better food, access to food, beating out not just massive corporations, but corporations who actually buy food together internationally and clutter up those markets, that is maybe a 20% consideration of people who are leaving stable lives and still have difficulty, or quite like the rest of us, would love to have that better, healthier food. Or like many of us, our warranties are starting to wear out and we'd like to be healthier. But to lose sight, and I guess I'll just have to say what Carolyn came in saying, there's a crisis out there recurring, and the rest of us have been shook because we go to the store and the damn stuff costs more, and some of our discretionary spending is going away. Think about when you reach for the cupboard or the fridge and there's nothing there. That's hunger. That's what we're talking about. So the framing of food security, I think, has become a bit problematic. We should have food sovereignty. We should have some regard for, Dan, the benefits, actually, of having many producers of something as useful as milk. You only have to look at what the U.S. consolidation did instead, not really passing those price savings on. But I think we have to separate the conversations to some extent. Sure, they're linked. We all have a romantic attachment to our food to some or lesser extent. But we need to stretch our imagination and say, we should not stand for hunger in this country, or we have no ambition left. So sorry, I overdid that. But just to put back to you, because I think we've lost sight of what for a while actually drove down the demand for food banks. Food banks, just before Carolyn started, there was less need for it. The child benefit did that. The expanded child benefit did that. A whole bunch of people being put on a higher benefit level in Ontario when the McGuinty government came in did that. It's practical, everyday work. And it's not for the bureaucrats. It's your community standard. Do you have a standard where you don't want kids going hungry? Because the premier of this province hasn't increased the food allowance. He saved $829 million a year taking food off the plates of kids on Ontario Works. Are you okay with that? Are you good with that? Everything else you see them doing, every little benefit they pass back to you, is that more important than that kid growing up healthy and participating in class? You know what the lowest priority of someone who has kids and uses a food bank is? For a school snack program. Why? Because they want to feed their own kids. Don't take that dignity away from them. Don't think for them. Don't think that those people managing nickels aren't smarter than all the rest of us in terms of how to raise their kids. Single parents, 40% of them going without food in the latest food bank survey in order to feed their kids and clothe them and do other things. Don't try and put food in their hands when maybe they got to meet the rent. Maybe their kids got to look good because they got a presentation in the front of the class and they're prepared to go without food or less meals for a week. Like, let's treat this as the dynamic problem it is, not a static one. This is not the same people luckily coming all the time. The saving grace is we don't have a permanent underclass, but it's a real struggle. And what's missing is empathy from the rest of us to say, we don't want this to be something that's permanent. We don't want Carolyn to fall down from the exertions that she and the other food bankers have to do. There's a $1 billion domestic food relief organization, collective food banks in your country, and you're letting it happen here.
So thank you so much for that contribution, and no need to apologize. I think the style falls very much from the content. We have, we want to have the opportunity for the panelists to respond if.
I just want to say preach, but that's I think, I mean, Gerard and we've spoken many times about this, and I would echo what he said. I mean, we know the solutions to move the needle. We know how to make change. There just has to be the will, and we're not seeing that.
Okay, well, in that case, we have time, I think, for just one more question now, and we have a mic over this way.
Thank you. I'm just joining the choir you started. My name is Dr. Massey, and I work at Roots Community Services, an organization serving African, Caribbean, and Black communities in Peel region. So I know we've been talking about numbers all day, and I wanted to bring people's stories, because each number represents people behind them. And when I was working at a food bank, I did work at a food bank in my undergrad years. And one of the stories that stays with me is I was sitting with a woman who I call Grandma, and it's the dignity. Going to food banks take away people's dignity, because sometimes people choose not to go because of how they feel their dignity is stripped. Because who goes to beg for food? Right? Like, I want us to imagine going to go ask for food. And when you go asking for food, you also ask your household, how many people are in your household? So she was living by herself, but she wanted to have a little get-together, because in this country, if you have no family, it can get isolating. So she had a few friends, and she wanted to have enough food that day to share. But because her household is marked as one, you can only get food for one person. But you also don't want to show people that you can afford to serve them a cup of tea and give them bread. And she was crying that day. And for me, this is, someone like my grandmother crying because they can't afford to serve a cup of tea. So when we look behind these numbers, I want us to be seeing the people behind here. And right now we're talking about food banks are band-aid solutions. So are we looking at the root causes of these food indignities and these food insecurities? Are we shifting and looking at how we shift the policies that we currently have, that somebody highlighted, that are 20 years old, and looking at how this country, as rich as it is, when you talk about, for example, SOBIs giving indigenous communities permission to access seeds that they have been harvesting for centuries and centuries, that in itself is an indignity. And we need to be looking at how we're looking at food sovereignty, how are we returning people's dignity so that they can live healthy lives, as this now leads us to healthcare and access, and how that looks like when we continue to strip people of their dignity because they can't afford to put foods on, on their tables. Thank you.
We appreciate that question very much. Just for time reasons, I'll ask just one panelist to respond.
Thank you so much for your interventions, and absolutely agree. And I will say that for the last speaker, one of the things that became clear was that, again, that people actually with many of the folks who are coming to some of the food banks I've worked with, or some of the community groups here and overseas, was that they basically asked for what we would call whole grains, culturally relevant whole grains that they could cook, because that allowed them to keep the dignity, allowed them to keep that bit of food sovereignty going. But in fact, for both of you, what I'd say is, in fact, I was hoping maybe the junior fellows can think of another panel at some point, because one of the things that got killed a few years ago is the basic income pilot. Because I think that is, again, another conversation that needs to be restarted, that Canada can afford basic income. And in fact, that would, I'm not number crunching type, but I'm sure people can crunch those numbers to see how much could be saved if the basic income was there, which allowed people, and then again, as you were saying, they can make the choice with it. But the point is that the basic income pilot, which was running in Hamilton, was, I don't want to name the particular government, but it is the provincial government which killed it. despite all the evidence that was coming in, that the basic income pilot was doing, that much and more, what was supposed to. And so again, these are conversations that need to come in, that to address food insecurity, to address hunger, that we need to break those silos and instead think about ways in which hunger can be redressed, but also we can think of long-term resilience rather than, pivot from one set of short-term policies to the other.
There you go. Thank you very much. And so we've talked, of course, in this panel, throughout many different ideas for what kind of shorter-term or longer-term solutions may possibly be desirable. But it seems that one thing we all have in common is this both practical and perhaps indeed even moral urgency of ensuring people are fed and people can be as much as possible food secure. Well, that is our panel, everyone. Thank you so much to our panelists and to our audience members as well. And I am very pleased to announce that it is now lunchtime in today's Walter Gordon Symposium. I believe lunch will be served in the upper library, and it should be available now, everyone. Thank you so much.